Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, 99% Planet, 9% Habit, a CISO playbook for closing the microsegmentation gap. Today's webinar is sponsored by Elicity and Omdia, and produced by Actual Tech Media. My name is Mackenzie Puttasi with Actual Tech Media, a future B2B company, and I'm excited to be your moderator for this session here today. Now, as we mentioned in the title, 99% of CISOs are planning or deploying microsegmentation, and yet only 9% have it protecting their critical systems. Today, we're going to dive into these figures and more findings from the new Omdia survey of 352 healthcare and manufacturing security leaders. And we are joined by two analysts who ran the survey, as well as two CISOs who have shipped microsegmentation at scale. And so we're going to have a fireside chat to really dig into this topic. Now, before we dive in and get everyone on stage, we're just going to go over a little bit of housekeeping to make sure you all get the most out of this session. And so I've already seen quite a few of you saying a quick hi, hello, good afternoon from around the US and beyond. But if you're just getting settled, just getting in the door here, if you look on that upper right-hand side of your chat, you should see chat, docs, and Q&A, 3 different tabs. And in the chat, I do encourage you to say a quick hi, hello, hola, bonjour, aloha, whatever greeting you'd like. Let us know where you're tuning in from. And this is the perfect place throughout the session to let us know how this information is landing. So if you have any feedback, personal anecdotes, if you're surprised, if you want to share an interesting tidbit, we love to know what you're thinking and feeling. So throw it in the chats and we'll keep an eye on that throughout our session. All right, we've got Edward in from Michigan. We've got Houston in the house, New Jersey, California. Mark, good afternoon from Boston. We've got an aloha from Kauai. Hello there, Mark Giroux. Awesome, Chicago, Illinois, and the list goes on. So really great to see such a mixed crowd here coming on in. Now, the chat tab is also the perfect place to let us know if you have any technical issues during today's session. Hopefully that's not the case. We do recommend a quick browser refresh if you're having an issue with audio slides, video not loading, not syncing up. But if you're having persistent issues, let us know there in the chat. Myself and Deanna, who's our webinar coordinator, running things here in the background, will be there to help. A couple of the things you can consider to enhance your viewing experience. If you hover over your viewport in the bottom right, you can enable closed captions. And near the bottom of your screen, you should find a toggle for a light mode. So especially helpful on mobile or if you're maybe traveling or have limited bandwidth there. Now, we are going to be holding time for a live Q&A session today. We'd love to see your questions come in. So feel free to throw those in the Q&A section of the portal in that upper right tab, and we'll do our best to answer as many of those live here on the session as we can. There's also a docs tab, and in there you have a few great follow-ups or extensions to this conversation we have going today. There's a solution brief around Elicity microsegmentation, accelerate zero trust security in weeks, not years. We also have the microsegmentation has matured. Is your security architecture keeping up? So that's from the Omdia side. And then for the ebook, we have microsegmentation has matured, and that is also in a PDF format from Elicity. So grab those now, grab them later, save them, bookmark them, but don't wait till the bitter end because we definitely don't want you to forget. And then last bit of fun, we do have a $250 Amazon gift card up for grabs here today. We're going to draw that at the end of today's session. You do need to be live and present throughout this session to qualify and meet the price terms and conditions linked in that docs tab there. Alrighty, and with that, I'm excited as we dive into this topic here today to bring on our first couple of speakers who ran the survey, but I'm going to introduce our full panelists here, and then we'll get those first two on stage. So please help me in welcoming Holly Hennessy, who's the principal analyst for OT and IoT, cybersecurity at Omdia, and co-author of the survey. We have Rick Turner, Chief Analyst for Cybersecurity at Omdia and co-author of the survey. And then we'll be joined a little bit later by Jason Elrond, who is the Chief Information Security Officer at Multicare Health System, as well as Edmund Mack, who's the SVP and CISO at Cencora. So with that, excited to have Holly and Rick come up on stage here. Welcome, welcome.
Awesome, thank you.
Lovely stuff. Thanks a lot, guys. I guess I'll start. Holly, I'll give a little bit of the background of what we're talking about here. Oh, by the way, if anybody is listening to this as a podcast when they're out jogging or whatever, rather than watching it, it's easy to distinguish who's who, because Holly and I will be the two British accents, which of course means that if we, following Hollywood tradition, we'll be the baddies in the film. But in any case, so Holly and I were asked to carry out by a listing. We were asked to carry out this survey on microsegmentation, which we were very interested to do because, as you probably know, microsegmentation, after being around for the best part of a decade, is enjoying something of a, I don't know if I want to call it a renaissance, but it's certainly come back into the conversation big time, not only because of cloud, but more particularly because of AI. There's a whole bunch of reasons why microsegmentation has become increasingly relevant in the broader technology conversation as a means of implementing zero trust. So as Mackenzie was saying, we did indeed talk to these 352 folks as decision makers, and we specifically wanted them from two areas, both of which are represented by the CISOs, who we're going to be talking to a little later. In other words, we've got the healthcare folks and the manufacturing folks. And because Holly covers specifically the OT and IoT world, she helped me co-author the thing. I cover the waterfront. In other words, I do a bit of everything in cybersecurity, looking at all the different trends going on. Now, we did specifically limit it to people, to companies of more than 1,000. So we've got kind of the enterprise end of the spectrum, or the larger end of the spectrum, not the ma and pa shops, not the smaller houses. That's not to say there won't be, I don't know, law firms that have very sensitive data and might need microsegmentation, even though there's only 150 of them. But that's really the demographic that we were trying to address here. And as it says there, we got half and half of each of the two particular verticals that we were interested in. I'll move swiftly on to the next slide. And as we see here, we asked them, the way we framed the question for this one was, what percentage of your critical assets are you currently defending, if you like, with microsegmentation? Or if you like, how many of your what percentage of your current critical assets are currently microsegmented? I want to put it that way. And we were amazed to find that only 9% of our respondents were 81% or more of their critical assets. In fact, 40% of the respondents said that they were somewhere between 21 and 50%, which is a little bit gobsmacking, in as much as I feel like if you say, well, I've got 50% of my critical assets fully micro-segmented, the other 50% not, is a little bit like saying, well, I live in a 2-story house and I've got fire insurance for upstairs. I mean, it's kind of useless. No, I don't mean to be cruel. It's not useless, but I mean, you've clearly not got there yet. Maybe they're in a journey, we hope, towards broader microsegmentation implementation. We certainly asked them also about some of the difficulties that they've got, but clearly there's a lot of work to be done. We think there's also an information gap that needs to be bridged in terms of what microsegmentation is today compared to what it was a decade ago, and what network segmentation was even further back. So there's all of that going on. And let me jump swiftly on to the next one. So look, we kind of wanted to say, okay, how can I put this? H, what do you think about this? I mean, Holly, I'm asking you, what's your first take on this particular slide?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting here because you can kind of see, why the gap is there. And obviously a lot of organizations are using more legacy technologies, or they haven't yet, been able to experience the benefits of modern microsegmentation, which is obviously the crux of the white paper that we put out, which you can all read. And one of the things there you can see that it's one of the issues is that these legacy technologies are blind to IoT, OT, IoMT, and that's particularly critical for certain industries like manufacturing and healthcare, which we surveyed. So that gap is perhaps wider than you might see in the IT side of things. Given the devices that they have, the constraints that those devices have, legacy technology also often utilizes agents, and you can't deploy hundreds of agents on many of these systems. Previous approaches also don't scale as well. So, that's a problem in general for many organizations. But when you've got, I think the stats like 15 devices per hospital bed, that really kind of adds up. And that can be really difficult when it comes to trying to scale and deploy, like a efficient microsegmentation solution across those critical assets, which we've asked about. One of the other things that I think is a bit nuanced that I wanted to kind of bring out from the survey is that we also asked kind of challenges that were experienced with these legacy technologies. And one of those was business disruption. So around 30% of healthcare organizations had experienced business disruption with their previous project, which is obviously not great. And it adds kind of more gravity when it's patient health that's on the line, or, a clinician that needs to access information and data. So it's kind of a bit of a different story for these industries, where something that does cause disruption can then really put you off trying the project again. And one of the other things we did see is that organizations have done this, tried this multiple times, and still not kind of got there. So I really think it's more of an execution problem. From what we've seen, it's really clear that organizations want microsegmentation. 99% are either in the process or they'd like to have it at some point. They understand the benefits of it, but they haven't really found anything that's kind of working for them in their environments right now.
Yeah, there is a little bit of a sort of a once bitten, twice shy, or maybe several times bitten and now shy about microsegmentation in terms of anyone who's dabbled in it, say 7-8 years ago, and looking at it where it's come now. It definitely, I almost feel sometimes like we should be really talking, one should isolate what's going on now from what went before. And I'm almost tempted, I mean, I'm not in marketing, but I'm almost tempted to talk about next gen microsegmentation, because it really is a difference from what has gone before in terms of it being agentless, far easier to deploy and so forth. And there is definitely some work to do to just inform the market that there is so much, it's so much easier to do than it was, at the back end of the 2010s, for instance. So yeah, I think that's a fair point you make. Now look, we can rabbit on here for England, but I will say, Mackenzie, as far as I know, you've now got a poll question which we need to throw over to you to pose to our audience to make sure they're all not got to sleep or run away from all these Brits talking rubbish.
Exactly. It's not rubbish though. This is really good. I'm already interested to to go a little bit further, go a little bit deeper. And like you mentioned, even though microsegmentation has been going on to some degree, it's like a new era. So I think this is quite an interesting way to put it. And I'm excited to hear from the rest of the panel as we go deeper. But that said, poll is open. So we have on your right-hand side between the chat and docs, a poll basically asking what percentage of your users, workloads, and devices have least privilege access policies in place today. And we are sharing up the live results. So we are very curious to see where you're all coming in at. Are you in that 9%? Are you in that 1 to 20? A little bit broader range, 20 to 50? Are you in the 51 to 80 or 81 plus in that superstar status? So we'll leave this open maybe just 30 seconds to a minute, but Holly, Rick, be curious to see what you think about these results as they're rolling in.
Yes, I'm interested to see where the audience is, the majority of them, as we go through here. It's certainly fair to say that while microsegmentation has come back into the conversation as never before, it feels like it's still early days for this new generation of microsegmentation technology. So I should be interested to see quite where the folks land with these results. Any thoughts from you, H?
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that really stood out when we were doing the research is that there's not actually that many who have hands-on experience with these more modern technologies. I think it was around 20%. So you've got people that might be kind of aware of it, but they haven't actually used it. Yeah, it's one of the reasons why it was quite exciting to do this research and really kind of delve into it and see what opinions were. And also, yeah, to be on this webinar so we can kind of, raise more awareness and talk more about what is out there now that can just essentially make things a lot easier. So you're not really stuck at that, only 10% of your critical systems are micro-segmented, or the 20% mark can get a lot higher in terms of success there.
Perfect. So it looks like we've got about 18% landing in that 1 to 20. We've got about 30% landing that 21 to 50, about nearly 40% in the 51 to 80. And then just 1380 and above there.
Okay, so it's relatively similar, maybe a little bit better than the server respondents, but still, still a way to go. Rick and I were talking about this earlier, and I think it's kind of interesting because the question was around in the server was around critical systems. So you'd think that that would ideally be first point of call, right, to make sure that your most critical systems are successfully segmented, and that's what kind of organizations were struggling with, especially in these industries where they tend to be legacy and more difficult to approach, for sure.
Excellent. Okay, I'm going to close this poll out here, and then I believe it is time to bring up the rest of our panel. So please, everyone, help me in welcoming here Jason and Edmund to the stage. And let's go. Perfect. Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Hello.
Okay.
All right. So do we want to go a little further on why the gap persists from a CISO perspective here?
Yeah, I'd be interested to hear what the guys have got to say on that one.
Let me jump in, I guess, on that one. VLANs and ACLs still matter when I'm looking at this here, but they weren't designed to solve today's identity device workload and lateral movement problem at enterprise scale. So what I see is a lot of organizations built segmentation around where something sits on the network, and today that risk does not map cleanly to a subnet anymore. In healthcare, in healthcare, the devices that worry us most are most often not the ones, they are the ones we cannot put an agent on. We can't easily patch them, and we definitely can't interrupt without causing operational issues. So the idea of VLANs and ACLs, that's an old model that's too static for a dynamic environment, especially when we have new things on the new technology on deck. I'm looking at you, AI.
Yeah, makes sense.
Perfect. And then, gentlemen, I think we want to dive in a little deeper around sort of CISOs on this topic. What do CISOs want? What are the benefits that CISOs are expecting? And then we want to get into some primary business drivers as we go forward as well.
I think we might have a slide on that as well, don't we, Mackenzie?
We may just.
Oh, good.
Here we go. Is this the right one?
Yeah. I think that's the. Yeah. Identity.
Yeah, I think.
Carry on. Sorry.
Yeah, I could take that. So the reality is, we've talked about it, Jason joked about it, looking at you, AI, right? But the reality is, as we work within our organizations, we're getting a lot more complex from the services that are in our environment, how we interact with our customers. You look at a lot of OT environments, they're coming online to do just-in-time fulfillment or some type of customized capabilities from a customer perspective. In the modern day, the conversation is, how do we bring agents into our environments, plus critical manufacturing at the same time? That critical manufacturing has, the ability for that to be extremely resilient is really important for all of our businesses, no matter what domain that you're in. So there's this tension, this good, healthy tension between how do we as organizations enable innovation And at the same time, how do we make sure the day-to-day business operations, work flawlessly without any type of impact or interruption? On the other side of that, it's our not so friendly cyber attacks that we get concerned about, right? In the CISO space of, well, what happens laterally when these environments are threatened, and there's an impact in our IT environments that impact our OT environments. There's an impact within our AI agents, and they have access to the entirety of the environment. Historically, the conversation's been guest networks and all these other sort of third-party access concerns that you have into your environment. And the reality is, it sort of brings us down a path where we need to segment all these assets and services from each other so that they can play in their sandbox safely. This is really where identity-based segmentation becomes important. It's really about understanding and knowing the asset, knowing what it is doing, what it's supposed to do, and being able to, how do we scale that access in line with the speed of the business, right? Because nothing's static. We live in a very dynamic world. It's getting, if anything, more dynamic. So, the days of a VLAN and being able to say A can talk to B are going away, because A is changing its use case, B is changing what it can do as well. So we need to be able to move at the same pace of the business, at the same pace of innovation. And that's why, CISOs are looking for both the avenue of how do we protect the assets, protect what's really important to us, protect our crown jewels. Equally, how do we allow the organization to move at speed and move at pace and bring more innovation to our customers and clients that we serve?
Yep, absolutely. I want to double down on everything Edmund just said there. Identity-based segmentation is appealing because it lets us move from network location to business context. And he mentioned, the speed of the business. I look at it this way: how can least privilege work at the speed of care in healthcare, right? So the practical shift is from what VLAN is this thing on to, like Edmund was saying, what is this thing? Who owns it? What does it need to talk to? And more importantly, what should it never talk to? That's a much better security question. And I'd like to know, does not make network engineers irrelevant. It actually changes the work from hand maintaining brittle rules to actually engineering policy, visibility, exceptions, and real operational guardrails.
Perfect. So I'm curious to look into these sort of top benefits that are being seen and what respondents from this survey that was taken or carried out want to achieve with modern microsegmentation.
HIPAA, my favorite. I'll lead off, then I'll hand it over to Edmund for this one. But I'll say, compliance matters, but the real value is when compliance, visibility, and resilience all point in the same direction. So I wouldn't sell this to a board as a compliance-only project. I would frame it as a blast radius reduction, ransomware resilience, and operational continuity, with compliance as one of the proof points. So you see compliance up there at the very top, but it's all those other things. I guess my best board line for this one would be the business value is not that we brought a control. The business value is that we reduce the number of system services and clinical workflows that can be affected by a single compromise. So that's how I look at this. That's one of the major benefits I see in this space on the slide. Edmund?
Yeah, no, agreed. I think the other piece that people are saying in the background, enhanced compliance, you have HIPAA, NIST, PCI. A lot of organizations are going through some aspect of maturity across their organization and control effectiveness, which definitely has a compliance aspect to it. But when you look at the need for the capabilities around segmentation or controls around segmentation or zero trust, the reality is it hits a lot of your compliance requirements as well as your security needs. Obviously, if you're in a healthcare space or if you're in financial services, the reality is these things solve your compliance needs, that you have regulators coming to you on a regular basis asking, what are you doing in this space? So I think similar, like we're going to to go into a world where segmentation is more important given the dynamic, reality of our landscape. But I would make the argument that if you looked at identity, you would see the same thing. A lot of people would respond back and say it's for enhanced compliance because for every compliance control, there's an identity component to it. And I think that's the same thing we're seeing here.
Excellent. I'm always curious to see how, poll results will come in. And then, for someone who's sort of on the ground, living this, breathing this every day, does it feel true or does it ring true? So it's interesting to hear your feedback. And then I know we wanted to get into primary business drivers here. So similar in terms of, what are you finding true and do you agree with some of these results we see out of this?
Yeah, I think this is actually like a really good sort of conversation point in that zero trust strategy has been a conversation point for like the last 10 years. And people really trying to get to, really this architecture philosophy around, never trusting and always verifying assets across the environment from both a network and identity perspective. Again, like I see this being like very true, the way that this is sort of landing, that, as you look at organizations and the drivers around microsegmentation, it's really about zero trust. I think maybe the insight would be, historically in some areas, people think about zero trust and, sort of go down to the SSE or SASE space and think about the offerings of, Zscaler and such. That is really, let's think of it as human to device, not necessarily device to device. Yeah. So, I do think we need to separate the conversations a bit of how do your users connect to systems and services versus how do your services connect and communicate with each other. And that's really when you get into microsegmentation, that true trust strategy around service to service communications and trust.
Yeah, I agree. And for healthcare, zero trust has to be implemented in a way that respects care delivery. You cannot secure the hospital by breaking the hospital. And when you get it down, people tend to get grumpy about that one real quick. So when we're talking about non-human identities now too, right? So zero trust can become a slogan. It really has, unless you turn it into specific controls. Microsegmentation is one of the places where zero trust becomes operational. I think there was a question there. What's the difference between microsegmentation and zero trust? I think it's a mechanism. So what we want to do is we want to make zero trust no longer a poster. We just run around saying, hey, it's a zero trust, zero trust, zero trust. I once told the board that I'm not into zero trust architecture. I'm into the never trust architecture, the NTA. But it has to become policy, and you have to have enforcement, visibility, and measurable risk reduction. And like Edwin was talking about, those areas are not necessarily to human identity. We're talking about non-human identities, right? NHIs. And I think even in that space, back to AI again, you're going to end up with non-human identities that are non-deterministic as well. So they resemble or act kind of like a human, but they're not. Again, we're talking about agents and AI. So it really has shifted and is continuing to shift the environment that we have to work in.
Awesome. Jason, Emmett, thanks for fielding that question there. And I wanted to see if Holly or Rick, do you have any questions, any feedback after hearing from these two?
I had some thoughts, if I can dive in first, Holly. I just wanted to I wanted to say that it's interesting that there was a question, what's the difference between zero trust and microsegmentation? I've traditionally regarded, I did a lot of presentations 4, 5, 6 years ago when zero trust was the flavor of the month, as it was for a long time. And I would always start by saying, look, zero trust is not a technology. It is a philosophical stance, a state of mind, call it something like that. In other words, I'm not going to trust anybody implicitly ever again. I'm going to make sure that I verify them every time they come into my environment, and more to the point, I'm going to keep tabs on them while they're in my environment. And in other words, I always I think it was Edmund said that, it's never trust, always verify. And I often append a third sort of dimension, which is and continuously monitor, because the thing is that they can hijack an identity after it's been registered and got in and is kosher, and the next thing you know, someone's doing something dastardly because their identity has been hijacked by someone else. So there is also that dimension. But in any case, it is a philosophical stance about cybersecurity, which is manifested in various ways. And just like Edmund said, SASE SSE is really zero trust for humans, for users, whereas microsegmentation is zero trust for everything else, or zero trust for assets, zero trust for workloads, zero trust for systems. And of course, this is where it's relevant in the IoT space and OT. Over to you, Holly, to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think in the OT world, there's been a lot of conversation over the last few years on what does zero trust mean in OT, or how do I get zero trust in OT? Or there's a mandate from the IT side of the business of, oh, okay, well, we want to kind of extend this into operational technology environments or IoT environments as well. And that's kind of been like a long running theme. And it's interesting because you hear a lot of different technologies that are then branded as zero trust for OT. But as you said, like not one technology is that. But I think there are a subset of technologies in this market which can measurably improve or extend your zero trust strategy into OT, microsegmentation obviously being one of them. And I think that again is another way in order to kind of showcase that ROI essentially on being able to actually have measurable deployment in the OT world, where it's traditionally been quite difficult. And it is still an area where a lot of organizations are struggling in kind of other research I've been doing with OT CISOs and leaders and decision makers. It's one of the areas that has kind of like the least readiness. So organizations are trying to find ways in which they can bring zero trust into the OT space for sure. And I think, this is a good way to do it. And especially having the identity base, it allows more consistency. Obviously, that stood out as being kind of a real driver and a real kind of requirement from CISOs in the survey. And I think it makes sense. It's not just pulling in existing identity telemetry and data for that context, but it's also adding additional context to the SOC. It's kind of working the other way around. If you're able to have a solution that integrates well, that came up as one of the biggest challenges for previous projects, is that there wasn't good integration between legacy microsegmentation or segmentation technology and existing security tech stacks. But being able to kind of add that additional context after the fact as well can be really helpful to kind of make sure that there is that cyber resiliency in place, and you've got even more visibility into what's happening device to device rather than just on the user front. So yeah.
Yep. And I'll just put a cap on that one. Zero trust is a methodology and an architecture. It's not a technology. It's not a specific solution. That's what it is. Identity-based microsegmentation is one of those solutions that's going to be able to help you adopt that methodology, adopt that architecture in your environment.
Yep, agreed.
That's a perfect bow or ribbon tied around it. Thank you, Jason. Now, I'm noticing a lot of questions are coming in from the audience, but I did want to touch on one final thing before we sort of shift into the Q&A segment here. And I know, Holly and Rick, you had seen quite a bit of results coming through around different user types needing special consideration, and sort of which user types and which industries we're seeing quite a bit of use and not. So I'd love to sort of dig into that with you too.
Yeah, that's on slide 9. That's exactly it. Yeah, that's the one. H, over to you, mate.
Yeah, and I think this kind of touches on what I was speaking about at the beginning, in terms of there's a lot more to consider if you're in these industries, right? You might not even necessarily have staff that are permanent members of staff. You've got people that are coming in, transient workforce that are coming and leaving, and it just adds that complexity which organizations have to kind of deal with, and then have been a drawback of previous projects if they haven't worked, if they haven't been able to get a handle on visiting clinicians, or people remote remote connecting into your operations as well. So I think that's something that, showcases how legacy solutions don't necessarily cater to these nuances, and being able to go with that identity-led approach can, help you deal with these wide range of users that need consideration.
Perfect. Rick, anything you want to add to that?
Well, no, I was just going to say that the remote engineers scenario in the manufacturing world is something that, I remember talking to an outfit 8-9 years ago, I think, who said that one of that they were in Australia, and they said, well, a lot of our kit is actually provided by a US outfit, and we really don't like the fact that every time they need to carry out any kind of maintenance on the stuff that they've provided us, that we have to open up a VPN, which is basically punching a hole through the firewall in order that they can come in. And we really resent that when they're coming in from the other side of the planet. So it kind of makes sense that that would be a top concern on the manufacturing side. And of course, the visiting clinicians, you've got, I would venture to suggest that the problem you have there is that these people are very highly skilled at surgery or whatever, but probably have egos the size of a small country, and therefore you're really, to control what they can and cannot access is pretty vital, because they're going to be wandering in with their own laptops or their own tablets, and expecting access to all kinds of records and things like that. So really locking them down and segmenting them away so that the attacks coming through their devices can't do too much damage is going to be pretty critical. It makes eminent sense that those two should be at the top of each of those verticals' concerns.
Perfect. Thank you, Rick. You two, I see healthcare is on this slide here with visiting clinicians, clinical staff. We had a question come through from Alexander. He's asking, can identity-based segmentation be applied to the Internet of medical things?
Yeah. You want me to take that one? Absolutely. So when we're talking about IoMT, or we used to call it biomed, back in the day before it was no longer cool. And by the way, I wish I could say dastardly in a conversation and not make it sound odd like Rick was able to. It just flowed. But beyond that, so this is where it's really important to have something that is an identity-based micro-segmentation item. So I can't put agents or patches or specific software on a lot of what we would call IoMT. It was never designed for it. It was designed to help with the delivery of patient care. So the only way we're going to actually to help implement that zero trust architecture, that methodology, is through identity-based microsegmentation. Hey, let all these infusion pumps be recognized on the network as infusion pumps, and they're there. And then wherever they may roam, they belong in the same segment. They can speak with each other, and they can deliver the clinical mission without having that sort of blast radius or impact from other areas in the hospital network.
Thank you, Jason. Okay, we have a lot of questions. So anyone who wants to sort of jump in and add some extended information, feel free. But otherwise, I'm also going to kind of keep these moving quickly so we can cover as many as possible. This one came into the chat. It's a little long, so do your best. I'll read it out here. This is from Lionel. He's saying, as organizations scale across hybrid and multi-cloud environments, microsegmentation remains critical for lateral movement prevention, but who owns that and how assets and identities connect are often missing. How can organizations move beyond static policies to achieve dynamic, context-aware segmentation that adapts as their environments change?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? I think the reality is, as you go to let's call it zero trust or identity-based segmentation, there is this shift from topology to intent, right? And sort of like this old way of thinking of how do you solve these problems versus new way. I think we have to be honest in some aspects that the gap isn't across tools. There's plenty of tools. It's about some of the foundational capabilities and really thinking through it holistically. So as an example, in this architecture for zero trust, one of the questions is, do you really have an authoritative asset inventory across all these asset types? And with an agreed ownership model for how those assets will be managed. And we've seen this in some of the past solutions with a network access control. The question becomes, when an asset is not within these standards, what do we want to do with it, right? And it takes organizations years to figure out, like, this is the zone that it's going to go into, and this is what it can have access to. Can it get to the internet? Can it get to the internet? I think within this architecture, I think the problem is you need the asset inventory that's centralized. You need the ownership model as well. You need policies that are intentioned around identity. So when you look at hybrid cloud, cloud, on-prem, IoT, OT, one of the other pieces here is, like, you need a centralized identity access management solution across all these fabrics to make it all work. That is the hard work. I think in the conversation point is really going through and not really having a technical conversation, but having a business-driven conversation around intent of where do we want communications to go. Jason, anything to add?
No, I love that. And I think it lands where I'm saying now, where I always say identity is the perimeter. Identity is the perimeter. So whether that's on-premise, off-premise, hybrid between the two, the better you can get at your IAM program, your identity and access management program, with understanding the claimant to the identity, making sure that that's locked down, then you can say, okay, this identity may transit a lot of environments. My internal, this SaaS, that SaaS, this application, those things, because we don't necessarily have visibility, audibility, or direct control in other environments. But what we do have control over are the identities and the associated bucket of privileges that we want to assign to them, tasks they want to do. So wholly believe in that identity is the perimeter, and then how you deploy it operationally in your environment gets a lot cleaner. Because your environment, again, it's not just one physical place. So when you can understand the segmentation of access or the segmentation of rights associated with an identity, you're way ahead of the game.
Okay, so now that I've got you, Jason and Edmund, going here, we have a question for the CISOs. They've asked, for the CISOs, what did you stop doing? Like, what was on the original plan that you just killed once you got into this?
So who did I have to stop being before I could be the person I needed to be?
There you go. Exactly. This goes deep.
This goes deep. This is the philosophical question on this one, right? I'll throw it. I'll answer and then I'll throw it over to Edmund. But the big thing I would stop doing is trying to boil the ocean. Early segmentation plans often try to design the perfect state before they create practical value. That becomes too slow, too fragile, and too easy to defund. So I would also stop treating it as a network project. The network team is essential, but it has to include security, infrastructure, clinical engineering, application owners, business stakeholders. And I guess the other thing is I would stop assuming the cleanest technical design is always the best operational design. Because in healthcare, for instance, if the control breaks clinical workflow, it'll get bypassed, delayed, rejected, or defunded. So you have to design for adoption. Progress beats architectural purity, and you gotta kind of get out of that headspace where it has to be perfect. It actually just needs to be a little bit better than it was yesterday.
Very nice.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think you hit the nail on the head. I think the only thing that I would add is, like, really starting with the customer in mind. So I think one of the bigger changes is historically this has been a conversation that are championed by the CIO and the CISO. I've done a lot of work in the OT space and changing that thought there to say, who's the plant manager, who's the process engineer, who's the reliability, engineer or lead for the organization. Let's have the conversations with them at the center. versus it being like a tech and cybersecurity driven initiative. I think there's a mastery of such to say, how do you get the business to drive the outcome versus it being a technology driven outcome. And that's, to my prior point of trying to get from, policy to intent. When you have the business there and you want to really impact the crown jewels, which are critical to business, them understanding and them helping define the guardrails really allows you to, move at pace and move a lot faster. So that's probably one of the bigger pieces for me.
Excellent. Okay, I think we still have time for a few more questions. So this one could be interesting. They've said, honestly, my biggest headache is the stuff I can't put an agent on. Infusion pumps, a pile of old building controllers, HVAC nobody wants to touch. Where do you even start with those?
I think I kind of touched on it. Take it, Edmund. Take it in the OT environment.
It sort of touched on this. I think this is where it's a great question. And I was like, as I was talking through, I was thinking like, we probably need to go into some details like this that make sense. But one of the things that we were able to do historically is, look at these things and say, okay, we have infusion pumps, right? In your environment, where are they being used for? Sometimes it's used for just one thing, sometimes it's used for multiple things, right? But then being able to put that intention-based rule set around it. And what's really cool from an identity-based segmentation solution is you're now saying, infusion pump can talk to controller, or can talk to system, or can talk to XYZ. And then what ends up happening, and this is I think the magic of identity, the magic of truly being dynamic, is now they can take that pump, put it anywhere on the network, and it automatically works. It automatically connects to what's in that, intention-based policy, right? So what I have seen as you move to that, this is one of those changes where it's like, it's not your traditional, going into Palo Alto firewall and putting a static rule set in. Now you have a dynamic rule set. The business also realizes when we need to put another line in, we don't have to call IT or put in a bunch of tickets to make sure that everything's working and check out and change management and change control. So their ability to move faster, because now we have a policy that's based off of identity, is actually like, a good, it's just like the rocket engine behind the program, because once they realize, oh man, we can move a lot faster if we just help put this architecture together. That's the fuel for the jet as well.
And I love the speed there, because that thing, if I take that infusion pump from one room to another room or another floor or another location, it automatically knows what segment it needs to be on. I don't have to say, plug it into this port, this space to ensure it's there. So we have a lot more of a dynamic environment and a dynamic tool to follow it. And I think that's huge. I think the other thing that I got out of this, by the way, was I get NAC, network access control by default. So if I don't know you and I don't know where you're at, I automatically know you don't get any kind of access control. So that was, for me, almost like an unintended benefit that kind of rolls in there too. So if you're not supposed to be on mine, right, you plug it in, you immediately go to the waiting place for all you Dr. Seuss people out there. You go to the waiting place, and we'll figure from there. So I think it is much more dynamic, because they're right. They can just take it from A to B, and they'll know if it's on the same Wi-Fi, if it's on the same, they can just plug it in and go. So you deliver speed of value to the team way faster when you start using identity-based microsegmentation that is policy-driven. So I actually have a question for Holly. I'd be curious how often unmanaged device problems showed up in the research, especially across OT, IoT, IoMT.
Yeah, I mean, my exact recall of the stats might be a bit iffy, but we did have one question which was around one of the main struggles, and a lot of them were just, I think it was one of the second biggest issues was just not having visibility into devices, essentially into IoMT, OT devices. And that's, I think, one of the big kind of issues in terms of, if you don't actually have that visibility, then how are you going to get to a good point and deal with the kind of like how dynamic things are. So that was definitely one of the things that showed up. And in general, the visibility element of OT security as a market, or IoT security as a market, is kind of almost was the defining characteristic of the market as it kind of came to fruition. And you'd think then that visibility would be the kind of number one area where organizations have progressed. We still see it as, a big challenge for organizations. It's still not up there in terms of, something that the majority of organizations have locked down. So it's definitely still a large challenge in general, and was a challenge for the respondents of this survey as well. So yeah, we do kind of see that cropping up quite a lot.
Perfect.
Yeah, it's a good call out. Like what I've seen in just history of being in this space over the years. And again, like think of it more, change your mind to how do I enable the business? How do I speak business terminology? Like what do they care about versus being pure like network, CIDR notation driven. The reality is there's an investment put in. I talked about it a little bit earlier, but you can't do these programs without having a solid asset inventory, right? Mm-hmm. And an asset inventory management process and program. A lot of people want to start with the solution and say like, hey, let's just go segment. But it's like, you need these capabilities first. You need a asset inventory. You need to have a conversation around who owns these asset types. Yeah. And yes, there's going to be a lot of things that nobody knows who owns it. But that foundation is what really allows you then to say, how are we going to segment at speed? And more importantly, especially when we look at these OT environments, you don't have an opportunity for failure. Failure means that your business is going to lose revenue. As Jason alluded to, it's going to, if you're in healthcare, there's somebody that's not going to be able to get treated, could potentially die. So the reality is you can't afford the outage. So how do you do that? You know what you're touching because you have a really strong asset inventory that is managed, in a very sophisticated, continuous way. And there's tools that do that, right? So the marketplace of RMS, Clarity, et cetera, for in the OT area. There's a ton in the IT area, bringing together vulnerability management, et cetera. So there's tons of ways to do it, but it's definitely important.
Yeah, and I think that's makes sense why that integration piece cropped up so much, right? Because you essentially need to be able to utilize that, existing investments, and then you can, actually add the kind of control layer and the what next layer with tools like Microsegmentation, right? So you're building on that asset management and visibility in order to kind of, act on it essentially, which is something that I think is really important.
Agreed. I think we've done a great job here. We've gone wide, we've gone deep to a certain degree, and I do want to keep picking your brains, but we are getting close to the end of the hour, and I do want to give you all sort of a final sign off. So one thing I do want to draw everyone's attention to is that obviously we've had these amazing findings here throughout the session. So if you want to get this survey, read the full survey, get the full report, it is up on the screen there with the QR. But before I let all of you wonderful folks go, I'd love to just get any sort of final sign off, poignant thought, anything you want to leave the audience with here.
I'll jump in. So my advice to CISOs is to stop thinking about microsegmentation as a giant network transformation and start thinking about it as a focused risk-based program. Pick a critical workflow, pick a high-risk device class, pick a place you can find where lateral movement would create serious business or clinical impact. Prove you can reduce that blast radius, measure it, then expand. That's how this moves from a plan to reality.
Perfect, Jason. Thank you. Edmund, can we call on you next?
Yeah, I'd say for me, as I look at like these initiatives, similar to what Jason said, like take the risk-based approach. I think the other thing is like, reach out and have the conversations with peers that have gone through it and learn the hard parts. I do think there's a lot of how to interact with the business, how to be an enabler of the business that really needs to come first in these conversations to enable both the conversation of how do I move fast, but also protect from the downtime problems. The reality is, especially in this space, as you make change, if you do have a large issue, that will likely be the end of the program, right? So getting ahead of that is really important.
Excellent. Holly?
Yeah, one of the things I just wanted to kind of bring up that I thought was, a bit surprising or interesting from the survey we haven't touched on as much, was just the kind of sheer amount of employees that were kind of dedicated to this policy creation, testing and reporting across healthcare and manufacturing. I think it was, around 40 on average across organizations just for this kind of initiative, and it doesn't have to be that way. So deploying, these solutions that are more identity focused, you can be quicker, you can use less resource. It just frees up, already kind of overloaded employees, especially in OT, where organizations are struggling with funding and cost as it is, to look to other initiatives that can help with cybersecurity resilience.
Excellent. And Rick, last but not least.
Lovely. Thank you, sir. So look, I would first of all...
Oh, hold on, Rick. We're not hearing you super well.
Oh, okay. That's odd. I was doing fine all the way through.
Okay, that's sounding better now.
Okay, fair enough. I would encourage everybody listening and watching to think of segmentation not as one great blob, but as at least a book of at least 3 chapters that starts with network segmentation, which is what people used to do with their firewalls when everything was on premises, then moves to agent-based segmentation of about a decade ago, which was the first generation of microsegmentation, and then think of modern microsegmentation, which is the agentless approach, which is identity-based. And then we're talking about identity. Well, clearly you need an identity infrastructure that can handle not just human identities, but both the traditional non-human identities, service accounts, service principals and the like, but also the non-deterministic NHIs, which are coming into the workplace now, thanks to the explosion of agentic. And finally, I suppose I would say, sell this to the rest of the company as a risk reduction exercise, as I think Jason said earlier on, and not as a network segmentation or indeed just as a microsegmentation project. Think of it as risk reduction and combined with agility, because you can be agile with the modern microsegmentation approach. And that's it, really.
Fantastic. Well, you four, thank you so much. I think you've given us a lot to think about, some really great facts and figures, some really great practical tips and opinions. So until we get to do this again or dive deeper, I want to give you all one final thank you for being here.
Cheers, all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, everyone, we are going to wrap up shortly here. So again, thanks to everyone here for sharing their perspectives. If you haven't already got that report there, please do grab it with the QR. We also have a couple other follow-up materials there in the docs tabs, the solution brief. You've got the ebook from Melicity, and then from Omdia, you've got that micro segmentation, essentially like a visual, what do you call this? Sorry, you guys, blinking here. Infographic, beautiful infographic. So check that out. Lots of the facts and figures sort of summarized from what we looked at today. Alrighty, with that, we've got a quick survey popping up where the chat docs Q&A are. If you don't mind giving us a little bit of feedback on the webinar, the interface, the information, if it met your needs. This is just for us here at Actual Tech to get a good pulse check from you. We are also giving away the prize right away. So thanks for waiting till the end here. And our lucky winner of that $250 Amazon gift card is Jason Powell from Tennessee. So Jason, we're going to reach out by email, let you know how you can claim the prize, and then we'll get over to you right away. This is going to be sent out as an on-demand webinar in about 24 hours after we wrap here. So if you do want to check this out, watch it again, refer back to it, send it to an industry colleague, you absolutely can. But other than that, I just want to give one final round of thank yous. So again, thanks to to Elicity for making this possible. Thanks for the Omdia crew for this survey, these findings. And of course, thank you to all of our speakers. And the biggest thank you to all of you in the audience for being here, asking a boatload of questions. I know we didn't get to all of them, so we're going to pass those on, and you can get some offline follow-ups. Other than that, hopefully you left with a lot more than you came in with. If you do want to check out any other webinars, events.actualtechmedia.com is the place. You can also check the QR code there. But until our next webinar or session again together, I'm wishing you all an absolutely fantastic rest of your days. Take care, everybody.